A Short History of Spain and Portugal. And they said short.
Hmm.
But wow, this book covers centuries.
It really does.
You wouldn't believe the ground we're going to cover. I mean, we're talking ancient cave paintings, empires, dictators, revolutions, and that's just for starters.
It's true. This little corner of Europe, has actually been a huge player on the world stage. And today's deep dive is all about uncovering those kind of like hidden connections, the surprising influences that still echo today.
I love that. Okay, so whether you're someone who's like, hey, I'm going to Barcelona, or you just love a good story,
Yep.
or you're a history buff, buckle up, because we're diving deep into Iberian history. And trust me, you're going to want to hear this.
We're going to be going way back, even before the Romans, because, the story of this peninsula, it begins long before we see this like famine conquerors show up.
Yeah. Speaking of starting early, the book mentions cave paintings in Altamira.
Oh, yeah.
They're older than the pyramids.
Amazing.
What is the significance there? I mean, they weren't just like, doodling on cave walls.
No, not at all. These were sophisticated artists, really showing us that there was a thriving, complex culture in Iberia long before anyone else arrives on the scene. I think, we tend to think primitive when we hear prehistoric, but these paintings kind of like challenge that whole notion.
Yeah. It's amazing to think about those ancient artists creating art that would last for millennia.
Yeah.
But as fascinating as they were, those early Iberians weren't exactly alone on the peninsula forever, were they?
You're right. Iberia has this history of being a crossroads, a place
Yeah.
where cultures collide and combine.
Right.
Take the Phoenicians, those master traders.
Right.
Not only did they bring their goods, but they also brought something essential, a written alphabet.
Ooh. And let's not forget those Greek influences. Did our ancient Iberian friends have a taste for olives and wine?
Absolutely. The Greeks, they brought with them those, iconic Mediterranean staples, the vine and the olive. So next time you're enjoying, a glass of Rioja or snacking on some olives, you can thank the ancient Greeks and the Iberians who clearly had good taste.
There you go. That's my fun fact I can use. Speaking of connections, this next part is where things start to get really interesting. And it involves a name you might recognize. Hannibal. You know the one with the elephants?
Yes, Hannibal Barca, that Carthaginian general, famously marched those elephants over the Alps to attack Rome.
It's crazy.
It's an incredible story, but what many people don't realize is that Hannibal's family, the Barcas, had really deep roots in Iberia.
I did not know that.
Yeah, some historians even believe that the city of Barcelona might actually be named after them.
Wait, so Barcelona, that iconic city, could be named after Hannibal's family.
It's possible.
That's mind-blowing. It makes that whole Punic Wars thing from, history class feel much more real.
Right. It adds another layer to it.
Yeah.
Because the Carthaginian presence in Iberia, this wasn't just a footnote. It was a major factor in those epic clashes with Rome. And, the Iberian Peninsula, unfortunately, caught right in the middle.
As always. But let's be real. The Romans weren't exactly known for their hands-off approach to, well, anything.
Right.
So what did Roman rule actually mean for Iberia?
Well, it was brutal. There's no getting around that. The Romans, they were famous for their ruthlessness in war. But, they were also incredible builders and organizers. They brought their laws, their engineering skills, and, of course, their language, which, by the way, forms that basis for both Spanish and Portuguese today.
Wow. It's fascinating how the Romans, left their mark everywhere they went, from language to infrastructure. Speaking of leaving their mark, how about those Roman emperors from Hispania? There were a few, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't that tell us something about how the Romans saw this part of their empire?
It does. We often think of Roman provinces as being, on the kind of periphery, but Hispania was a source of great leaders, thinkers, even emperors like Trajan.
Right.
They weren't just exploiting the region for resources. They saw it as a vital part of their world.
Which makes those brutal conquests all the more tragic. Because it's clear that the people of Iberia weren't just passive bystanders in their own history. They were contributing to Roman culture and society at the highest levels.
Exactly. But Roman dominance, like all empires, eventually crumbled.
Right.
And that's where we get into this period of the Visigoths and the Moors, a period often misunderstood.
Oh, yes. The so-called barbarian invasions.
Right.
But you're going to tell me it's not as simple as all that?
Well, you know me too well.
Yes.
Yes. The Visigoths, those barbarians, actually adopted a lot of Roman ways.
Okay.
They weren't interested in burning everything to the ground. In fact, they even adopted a form of Christianity.
Though not the same as the Roman Church at the time.
Exactly. Their version of Christianity had some key differences, which would have interesting consequences down the line. But before we get to that, we need to talk about another group who left an indelible mark on Iberia, the Moors.
Here we go.
This is where it gets good.
This is the part where things get really interesting. They conquered most of the peninsula in just 8 years.
8 years?
8 years. That's insane. What made them such effective conquerors?
It wasn't just military might. The Moors, they brought with them this sophisticated culture, a different religion in Islam, and a thirst for knowledge, and it really transformed Iberia.
Yeah, it's funny. We always hear about the Dark Ages in Europe, but while the rest of the continent was figuring things out, Cordoba under Moorish rule was this intellectual powerhouse.
Exactly. Cordoba became a center of learning. Libraries, universities, scholars from all over the world. They were making advancements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine. They even introduced new agricultural techniques and crops to the region.
That's incredible. It really flips the script on how we usually think about this period. But as we know, the Moors didn't rule Iberia forever.
Right.
Enter the Reconquista.
Yeah.
An 800-year struggle that sounds like something straight out of Game of Thrones.
8 centuries is a long time. And you're right, full of drama, shifting alliances, unexpected twists and turns. And it wasn't just Christians versus Moors. You had different Christian kingdoms all vying for power, sometimes even siding with Moorish rulers against their fellow Christians.
Oh, yeah. Talk about keeping things interesting. But all this constant infighting must have had some kind of long-term impact on the Iberian Peninsula, don't you think?
Absolutely. On the one hand, this long struggle, it really helped forge those distinct identities of Spain and Portugal.
Right.
But, some historians argue that this inward focus, this preoccupation with the Reconquista, might have also caused them to lag behind when other European powers began exploring the wider world.
Which brings us to the age of exploration. And here's a curveball. It's Portugal, not Spain, that takes the early lead.
Right.
How did that happen?
Well, Portugal's success in the Age of Exploration can be largely attributed to one man, Prince Henry the Navigator. He was obsessed with sailing down the African coast, and not just for conquest, but for knowledge, for finding a sea route to the east.
So they were initially more interested in spices than gold.
Exactly. They wanted to tap into that lucrative spice trade, bypassing those land routes controlled by, guess who, the Arabs.
Wow. It's fascinating how all these historical threads keep intertwining.
It is. But while Portugal was focused on the east, a certain explorer named Columbus convinced the Spanish monarchs to fund his westward voyage.
Aye.
And, well, we all know how that turned out.
Spain stumbles upon an entire continent.
Right.
And suddenly the game changes. But not without some ground rules.
Yeah.
Right. What was the Treaty of Tordesillas all about?
So the Treaty of Tordesillas, it was essentially an attempt to, carve up the newly discovered world between Spain and Portugal.
Right.
With the Pope's blessing, they basically drew a line down the Atlantic and said, okay, east of this is yours, Portugal, west is ours, Spain.
Wow. That's a lot of power for one line on a map. Speaking of power, let's talk about Spain's golden age. It sounds glamorous, conquistadors, gold, all that. But it seems like there was a darker side to all that wealth.
There was. You see, Spain's ruler at the time, Charles V, also happened to be the Holy Roman Emperor, heir to the vast Habsburg domains.
The Habsburgs, they were like royalty on another level.
Exactly. But all that power, it came with a pretty hefty price tag. Charles V was constantly at war, defending this vast empire. And Spain, flush with this New World gold, they ended up footing the bill.
So all that gold from the Americas wasn't enough?
It wasn't. You see, Spain, despite its newfound wealth, had a very rigid social structure. The elite, the church, the landowners, they clung to those traditional ways.
They weren't exactly investing in the future.
Not really. They spent lavishly, fought wars, and they really missed the opportunity to diversify their economy or invest in their own industries. And the sad truth is, all that gold flowing in from the Americas might have actually hastened their decline.
Wow. That is a cautionary tale for the ages. But Spain's decline wasn't unique, was it? Portugal, too, faced its share of turmoil in the centuries that followed.
That's right. In the 19th and 20th centuries, both Spain and Portugal went through these really tumultuous periods. Revolutions, counter-revolutions, political instability.
And then, of course, came the dictators.
Right.
It's impossible to talk about 20th century Iberia without addressing that dark chapter.
You're absolutely right. The Spanish Civil War, a brutal conflict that tore the country apart in the 1930s, really created the conditions for Franco's rise to power.
And Franco's regime was notoriously brutal.
It was. He suppressed dissent, imprisoned and executed opponents, and plunged Spain into decades of authoritarian rule.
Meanwhile, Portugal had their own dictator, Salazar, who wasn't exactly known for his uh, commitment to democratic ideals.
Hmm.
How did these two figures, ruling very different countries, end up with such similar legacies? It's almost like a classic case of history, like rhyming in a way. Yeah, these two countries, they're facing their own internal struggles, and they kind of end up with these authoritarian regimes. But how did they manage to hold on to power for so long,
Yeah.
Because it wasn't exactly the most progressive period in history.
You're right, it wasn't. But we have to remember the world was a very different place then. I mean, the shadow of World War II loomed large. And then the Cold War, that created this global climate where stability, even at the cost of freedom, was often seen as, well, a necessary evil.
So in a way, that global context kind of helped them stay in power.
To some extent, yes. Franco, for instance, played the Cold War game masterfully. He positioned himself as this, bulwark against communism and secured a lot of economic and military aid from the West.
And I mean, all those tourists flocking to Spain's beaches in the 60s and 70s, that probably didn't hurt their image either.
Yeah, you're not wrong. But, while Spain was opening up, albeit, under an authoritarian regime, Portugal under Salazar, they remained stubbornly resistant to change. He clung to the last vestiges of their colonial empire in Africa, even as the rest of the world was embracing decolonization.
And those wars in Africa, they weren't exactly a walk in the park.
Not at all. They were costly, both in terms of, lives and resources, and they fueled a growing discontent with Salazar's regime.
Which ultimately led to his downfall.
It did. In 1968, Salazar suffered a stroke, and while his successor tried to hold on to power, the tide had turned. The military was disillusioned, the public, they yearned for freedom, and frankly, the world had moved on. The Estado Novo, Salazar's new state, crumbled in the Carnation Revolution of 1974, which was this bloodless coup that ushered in democracy.
Wow. And it was Spain's turn. Franco dies in 75, and it's almost like overnight, Democracy's back on the menu in Iberia. It's amazing how quickly things can change.
It is. But, as we've kind of seen throughout our deep dive here, historical change, it's rarely a straight line. Both Spain and Portugal, even as they embrace democracy and join the European Union, they still carry the scars of their past.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, how does a country reconcile its past with its present? How do these historical legacies, especially the legacy of colonialism, continue to shape Spain and Portugal's place in the world today?
It's a question with, no easy answers. But I think what's clear is that understanding history, with all its complexities and contradictions, it's crucial if we want to understand the present and navigate the future.
Well said. This deep dive has been, wow, an incredible journey. From those ancient cave paintings to empires, revolutions, dictators, democracies. Who knew a short history could be so packed with intrigue, tragedy, and ultimately hope?
It's really a testament to that, enduring human spirit, this capacity for both great darkness and this remarkable resilience.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll leave you with this thought. If history teaches us anything, it's that the story's never truly over. What happens next in the story of Spain and Portugal? Well, that's up to all of us to shape.